Hi everyone. This is a short video on the Xaxa Committee report. In this video, I'm not going to be giving a summary of the report. I'm basically going to talk about the report itself and whether or not you should read it, and I'll address a few questions that people generally have. That is, what is the report, whether it should be read or not, what part of the syllabus does it cover, so on and so forth. Now, coming to the actual report itself, it's a report that submitted its recommendations to the government in 2014, and it was headed by Virginia Xaxa, who was an anthropologist, and the report is mainly on tribal issues, and it talks about various dimensions such as education, health, land alienation, bonded labor, problems of PVTGs, denotified tribes, so on and so forth. It's a 450-page report. I'll just give you a look of the report so that you know. This is the report of the High-Level Committee on Socio-Economic, Health and Educational Status of Tribal Communities. This is the actual name of the report, and as you can see, it is chaired by Virginia Xaxa. And these are the contents. The contents include a basic idea of the geography and demographic profile of tribes. It gives you a slight overlook of how tribes are classified, and it's very good for people who don't really like. It's good for beginners who haven't read much about anthropology and they're just starting out. So this report is accessible in that sense that initially only it gives you the various dimensions of what a tribe is and is not, and how they're going to what are the problems that they face and stuff like that. And it goes on to also talk about the constitutional provisions such as the 5th and 6th schedule, livelihoods, the problems in employment, education, health, land alienation, displacement, legal constitution issues, where it talks about the Forest Rights Act and Panchayat Extension to Schedules Act and Land Acquisition Act. And all of this is within the syllabus, and it actually covers more than 50% of the syllabus. So the areas that it covers in the syllabus are here. It covers tribal anthropology, which is part of paper 2 of the anthropology syllabus, and it covers greater than 50%. So the areas it covers is 6.123, 7.123 and 9.1. I'll just give you a look of the syllabus so that you know exactly what we're talking about. So this is paper 2 of the anthropology. This is the syllabus. Tribal anthropology starts from 6.1. So 6.1 is biogenetic variability, linguistic, socio-economic characteristics. This part is covered in the introduction of the report, and the geographical and demographic distribution, where it gives a basic idea of how tribes are distributed. 6.2, this is a majority of the report covers this part, which is land alienation, poverty, indebtedness, educational facilities, underemployment, health and nutrition. 6.3 is also covered when it talks about how projects, MNCs, government development projects have affected tribals. 7.1, constitutional safeguards for scheduled tribes, is covered, and problems of exploitation and deprivation. It also covers 7.2, which talks about development programs and welfare measures for tribals. So the Xaxa Committee gives a review of the ITDAs, the tribal subplans, and so on. And lastly, it covers 9.1, which is history of administration of tribal areas, tribal policies, plans and programs of tribal development and their implementation, as well as the concept of PVTGs. Now so basically, as you can see, it's covering 50% of the entire syllabus, although it doesn't cover it in a way that you can only read this and that'll be all that you need. But it gives you very good content for value addition, and it also, because it's more in the form of a narration, it also gives you proper context and history and background of problems. So that's one of the major good things about the Xaxa Committee. Apart from that, I'd like to point out a few benefits that you receive when you read the Xaxa Committee report. One is that it is a very it has a lot of data in it, which is very good for keeping your answers objective in anthropology. So if you want to differentiate your answer from other people, the way you can do it is by adding examples, case studies, and data. Now, all of that, you also need to be able to quote sources, and Xaxa Committee itself has relied on data from NGOs, census committees, census and anthropology research, and all of that. So all of that is something that you can quote in your answers, and it gives you very good statistics on health, education, and demography of tribals. Apart from that, it's a very authentic document, so you can quote it without fear, even when you want to give you a review of some sort of government plan, say a tribal sub-plan, and you need to point out the criticism. So you can take a very balanced stand by just saying that the high-level committee or the Xaxa committee has brought out these limitations 1, 2, 3, 4, and that way you can also get around, criticizing the government and the implementation of policies by not coming off as someone who's overly critical. Thirdly, is that the report has a very deep analysis of tribal issues. So not only does it just tell you that this is what the issues are, it goes into the reasons and it also goes into the history of the problem. For example, when it talks about denotified tribes, it brings out how these policies were initially made during the colonial British rule, the Criminal Tribes Act. And then it also talks about the impact of those rules on the community itself and how that's continuing even now. So even if you read it just once, you get a very nice understanding, and then when you read it from some other source, it becomes all the more easier to understand the issues that tribals are facing. And it's a very deep analysis of these issues because this is what the committee was set up for. And the fourth point is that it has very good recommendations. Obviously, the committee itself relies on the past recommendations of other committees such as the Debhar Commission and other anthropology tribal committees basically set up by the government, and it has a lot of good recommendations. And generally, when you're talking about in the exam, when you're talking about any tribal issue, which is generally like one question is asked on problems faced by tribes invariably. So the way you can set apart your answer is by giving good recommendations which are given by a government committee itself. So that's really authentic and it's going to add value to your answer. Fifth is, of course, that covers a large part of the tribal anthropology syllabus. Generally, people read one book on tribal anthropology, which is very popular, the Nadeem Hasnain book on tribal India. However, if you want to score high, and people who have scored above 300, they generally rely on more than one source. And one would be the basic source and the rest would be value addition. So this is a great document for value addition. And the last benefit is that even if you have no prior knowledge on the tribal India situation, you don't know anything about tribes, if you're a complete beginner, you can still read this report. It's so accessible, the language is so simple, and it starts from the basics. It seems like the committee itself, assumes that you know nothing about tribal India, and so it gives you, like, the very first chapter itself is an introduction of who tribes are, how are they classified, and things like that, which is very helpful in case you're a beginner. So you don't need to be, you don't need to think that, oh, I've never, studied tribal India, maybe I'll read some other book and then get back to this. I would actually suggest if you read the Xaxa Committee report, it'll help you in reading other basic books. Now, the fourth aspect that I want to talk about is I've spoken to a few aspirants, the beginners who have just taken up anthropology. So generally what they ask is, ma'am, should I read this, entirely, or should I read the summary? Now, the reason why they ask that is the Xaxa Committee report is a 450-page report. Although it's not entirely 450 pages, there are a lot of graphs and tables, but still it comes across as a big report. And the idea is that, can I just read the summary, like how people read the second ARC? They just read the recommendations and they remember that and then they go. But I would suggest that if you have time, that is, if you can read this report before prelims, then I would suggest that you read the entire report. because it gives you a lot of context. So if you're only going to read the summary, it takes away all the story of a tribal issue or a tribal community. You're just going to take the recommendations and try to remember them in a completely out of context manner, and that makes it much more harder to remember, and you won't be confident about quoting those things in your answers anyway. So it's better to not read it only. That is, if you're not going to be able to quote them. Therefore, I urge you to read the report in whole before prelims. And right now, the prelims may get postponed, so you might find time to read the report. Or if you're preparing for next year, which is 2021, then you have more than enough time and you should read this report. And also another thing is, like, if you're going to read the summary, there's a lot of scattered information in the report which you will not be able to take. For example, although the report addresses a lot of issues, it has chapters on education and health. Within all of that, it also talks about things like bonded labor, indebtedness, which are not separate chapters, but there are parts in the report itself dedicated to those aspects, which is a part of your syllabus. So if you don't read the entire report, you're going to miss out all that scattered information. So I would generally recommend that you read the entire report so that you get you can extract as much information as you want. And lastly, although people say that it's a 450 or 438 page report, most of it, at least the starting and the ending, you have a lot of like a preface and all the abbreviations and things like that. So I've actually gone and counted this. It actually comes down to 350 pages of actual content, and even within those 350 pages, you have a lot of graphs and tables which occupy a lot of space throughout the report. So once you actually get down to reading it, it's a very easy read and it won't take a lot of time. The fifth aspect that I would like to address is, how do you go about reading the report? Do you read it from page number 1 to page number 438, or is there any other way? So you have to read chapter number 2, which is the introduction, and chapter number 3, geographical and demographic profile, before you go to reading any other chapter. This is the most basic information about tribes, and it's very short. The chapter is very short and very easy to read. So you must read these two, and then you can go on to read any chapter as per what part of the syllabus you want to cover. You can start with legal, constitutional issues and things like that. Almost all the chapters are independent, as in you don't need to read about the health part to learn about the education. You don't need to read them in a sequence. You can take up any topic as you like, but the first things that you should read are chapter number 2, which is the introduction, and chapter number 3, which is demographic and geographical profile. And when it comes to note making, I would recommend to make notes, because as I mentioned before, there is a lot of scattered information, and PVTGs, it'll address some PVTG issues in some part of the report, and then later on, 100 pages later, it will again bring up an example of a PVTG. So you need to be able to, when you're going to be revising this, you need to have one source from where you can quickly read these things, and therefore it makes sense to make a consolidated notebook of this. But I would suggest that you don't do this in the first reading. I would suggest that you read it entirely in the first go, and in the second reading, because then you know where different issues are addressed and how you want to consolidate your notes, I would recommend making notes in your second reading. And the last few points that I wanted to add was that, first, that it is a 2014 report, which means that all the examples and case studies given in it are prior to that. So now it is 2020. So you cannot quote 2012 and 2013 examples only. You need to be putting in more effort, and you need to go through the newspapers, or you can go through our Telegram channel, and you can try to you need to find more recent examples. You cannot just quote Xaxa Committee only. So don't think that this is going to be your only source of examples. It is a good source. You have a lot of authentic information. However, this cannot be your only source because it's slightly dated. And the committee itself has quoted a lot of anthropological research. It's quoted the census data, Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and Ministry of Forest Resources, and things like that. So instead of quoting Xaxa Committee everywhere in your answers, you can directly quote the census, or you can directly quote the researcher who has done the research, or the NGO, and things like that. It's also brought out a lot of it uses a lot of Supreme Court judgments as well. So those are also some things that you can quote directly. So basically it gives you you can extract even more information from the report than what it just says. Third is that it gives you an overall picture of the tribal situation. However, this cannot be your textbook for reading tribal anthropology. You need to have, say, a Nadeem Hasnain of Tribal India. You need to have another source which is your basis, which gives you the information in more detail, because there is 50% of the syllabus that this report does not cover. So all of that you need to be able to cover from a different source. And lastly, it is a great source for value addition, and this is precisely because it's quoting a lot of researchers and things like that, and it has a lot of examples, and whatever is relevant you can pick up and you can quote them in your answers, and I guarantee you that will make your answer stand out from everybody else. That's about what I wanted to address. I hope this video helped. Thanks.